The lands of Mordor stretched beneath a brooding sky, a vast expanse of jagged peaks and blackened plains, where the air itself seemed heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. Smoke rose from distant volcanoes, curling in slow spirals, as if marking the presence of a power that was both everywhere and nowhere. From the plateau of Gorgoroth, the Dark Lord's dominion radiated outward, a shadow pressing upon neighboring realms, bending them quietly to fear and expectation. It was a land of rigid geometry and oppressive architecture, where towers of black stone rose like jagged teeth, reflecting no light but that of flame and brimstone. Within these walls, the air was thick with the rituals of command, and whispers of allegiance carried far beyond the immediate hearing of mortal ears. Before the mouth of Sauron spoke, the shadow spoke itself. It moved in the sway of armies, the tremor of the earth under marching boots, and the silence of sentries watching. Always watching. In these early days, before the emissary emerged as a known figure, the voice was diffused, a presence felt rather than named, yet even then the principle was clear. Power could be conveyed without the wielder ever stepping into view. Mordor's hierarchy was a lattice of fear and ceremony, each layer of command a reflection of Sauron's will, bending reality subtly to project inevitability. Here, obedience was not merely expected, it was woven into the very cadence of existence, a rhythm that echoed from the halls of Barad-dûr to the barren plains below. The first emissaries of the Dark Lord were chosen not for physical prowess alone, but for the capacity to carry weight beyond their own bodies. They were conduits of shadow, carriers of intent, and interpreters of will. In their hands, a word could command armies, calm unrest, or sow suspicion among allies. From the moment of selection, they were bound to a sequence of rituals designed to sever the distance between personal desire and duty. Every gesture, every intonation was honed to convey authority and terror alike. These rituals were both subtle and severe, the silent repetitions that conditioned their presence, the mandated feasts and vigils that aligned body and mind with the ever-watchful Sauron. Through these measures, the emissaries became more than messengers. They became instruments of a dominion that thrived on the unseen, the half-perceived, the always anticipated. It was in these first, quiet movements across the plateau of Gorgoroth that the concept of the mouth began to take shape. The emissary would later be known by this title, yet in these early days he was nameless, a shadow among shadows, rehearsing the cadence of authority. His voice, when it emerged, carried the subtlety of smoke curling along the ridges and the inevitability of a tide that had always existed, though unseen. In the presence of captives or messengers, his intonation alone could bend wills, reinforce hierarchies, and inject a quiet dread that lingered long after he left. The sound was more than communication, it was a signal, a ritualized assertion of the Dark Lord's power, projected through a mortal frame. But even as these emissaries practiced the transmission of dread, the cost was quietly assessed. The act of speaking in place of another's will demanded a surrender of self, a constant alignment of thought, posture, and voice, with an authority whose motives were inscrutable. To inhabit the mouthpiece of Sauron was to carry not only commands, but also the shadow of consequence, the weight of every act enacted under that voice. The emissary became, in a sense, the ledger of fear, the silent recorder of loyalty, both for those who obeyed and for those who orchestrated the obedience. And so the land waited, silent and observant. The mountains, the plains, the molten rivers, they all seemed to anticipate a voice that would one day rise above the smoke, a single point of authority speaking for a darkness that could neither be touched nor fully perceived. The stage was set for a figure whose presence would define the boundaries of obedience, whose words would echo far beyond the plateau, and whose shadow would fall upon the hearts of all who dared glance toward Mordor. Before the mouth stepped fully into history, The land itself whispered his cunning, a prelude carried on the wind, on the tremors of marching feet, on the slow, inevitable shadows stretching outward from the black tower of Barad-dûr. In that silence, in that waiting, the principle was established. In Mordor, even a voice could wield dominion, and even a whisper could shape fate. The question remained, softly, in the smoke-filled air. How does a single mouth speak for the weight of a dark lord? And what will it take for the listener to endure? The air above the plateau of Gorgoroth never stilled. It churned with a slow, volcanic breath, ash rising in pulses, cinders spinning like flakes of burnt parchment. Beneath this weight of sky, in chambers hidden behind the darkened faces of Barad-dûr, the one who would become the Mouth of Sauron underwent transformation, not through sudden revelation, but through long submission. He had once been a man of learning. It is said, one who bent his thought not to warfare, but to the deeper structures of language and power. But in the realm of Mordor, knowledge was never passive. It was a tool to control, a map to obedience, and every path it traced led inward, toward the mind of the Dark Lord. The man who would become the Mouth was not chosen for might, but for malleability, for his ability to relinquish selfhood and take on the shape of a greater will. His initiation was not a single rite, but a season of erasure. In those lower halls of Barad-dûr, where the walls bore no echo and lamps burned with colorless flame, his name was taken first, not by command but by quiet refusal. None spoke it, none responded when he used it, and slowly the syllables themselves dissolved in his mind. Then came the mirrorless corridors, where every act of speech was recorded and studied, intonation measured, cadence refined, gesture corrected, until his voice no longer wavered with human doubt. He learned to speak in the Black Tongue, not as one who had acquired it, but as one who had been restructured by it. Every utterance carried the cadence of command, the resonance of domination. There were words that silenced others, words that froze limbs, words that summoned pain without blade. Yet these were not spells in the common sense. They were rituals of performance, each syllable imbued with dread because they were uttered on behalf of a will vast enough to eclipse the sun. Even Sauron, it is said, did not speak unnecessarily. His presence was felt in silence more than sound, his decisions handed down not through roar, but through the careful articulation of emissaries. And so the mouth was sculpted not to shout, but to speak with a calmness that allowed no room for refusal. He learned how to deliver decrees as if they were not choices, but inevitabilities. When he spoke, it was with the weight of a verdict already passed. But speech alone was not enough. To wear the mantle of the mouth, one had to carry it physically. His posture changed upright, never differential, even when kneeling. His gaze fixed forward, never lowering, never faltering. Robes of scorched silk were draped over his form, their patterns shaped like fractured runes, each one a binding. He did not eat in public, nor sleep where others could hear. The man who had once studied in the towers of knowledge became an emblem of obedience perfected, a living cipher, stripped of memory, saturated with purpose. It was not domination in the way a soldier feels the lash. It was deeper, more exacting. The transformation of the mouth required his consent, again and again, until even the act of consenting became instinct. When he answered to Sauron, he no longer processed the question. He spoke as one might breathe, the words not carried but issued from a source that lived within him now. This process, this fusion of body and command, was not without its quiet agonies. Those who trained alongside him faltered. Some went mad and were disposed of silently. Others rebelled inwardly, their voices never fully surrendering, and so they were reassigned to lesser roles, scribes, torturers, shadows of what they might have become. The mouth remained, not because he was the strongest, but because he was the most empty. And in that emptiness, the Dark Lord found perfect resonance. What emerged from those halls was no longer merely a man. He was a mask that did not come off, a vessel that carried pronouncements without pause. He had no name, for none was needed. He was the voice, the mouth, and in every utterance, Sauron's presence pressed outward, clothed in language. Those who heard him for the first time, Gondorian captains, Haradrim chieftains, even Orc commanders, reported something strange afterward. Not terror exactly, but a stillness, as if something vast had passed through the room without touching the floor. His voice did not break the silence. It rewrote it. And yet, even as he stepped into this role fully, questions remained. What would happen if the voice encountered contradiction? If loyalty were no longer certainty? If a mouth, once opened only in service, remembered how to speak for itself? The voice now moved through the ranks of Mordor like a current beneath the ash, shaping thought, sealing fate. But the cost of carrying another's will was still accruing, quietly, deeply, like a weight behind the eyes. Beyond the borders of Mordor, where the heat of Orodruin no longer warmed the stone and the sky remembered its stars, the presence of the Mouth of Sauron was first felt, not seen, not named, but unmistakably known, in the southern fields of Ithilien, in the forests of Druiden, and along the Anduin's slow moonlit currents. There spread a silence before speech, an unease that followed no armies. Scouts reported strange encounters, orc battalions falling back without cause, riders pausing mid-charge as if struck by unseen hands. But when questioned, they could only speak of a man cloaked, motionless, and somehow louder in silence than any war horn. The Mouth of Sauron had taken to the outer edges of war, not as a commander, but as a herald of despair. He did not wield banners or brandish swords. His weapons were intonation and implication. He came before sieges began, walked the valleys before arrows flew, and what he spoke echoed through every encampment long after he was gone. In the minds of Gondorian officers and Rohirrim scouts alike, a pattern began to form. The battles where morale faltered quickest were those where a black-clad figure had been glimpsed beforehand, speaking calmly to captains on the field, or simply standing atop a ridge with no escort watching. Those who met his gaze reported a feeling not of madness, but of unbearable certainty, as if they had already lost and were merely living out the script. In this way, the mouth became something more than emissary. He was omen, harbinger, a wound in the sky, and still few knew his name. To speak it would have been to legitimize him, and so he remained a whisper, the voice, the shadow tongue, the one who stands before the iron. He never threatened. That was the most chilling part. His pronouncements were not warnings, they were declarations. This road will belong to Mordor by sunrise. Your captain will not survive the third blow. The river crossings are already compromised, and though the defenders fought with desperate resolve, too often these words proved true. The mouth did not predict, he unveiled. But there was method behind this performance. His presence on the field served not only to unsettle the enemy, but to remind Mordor's own forces of the structure that held them. Orcs who faltered at commands stiffened when he appeared. Even lieutenants who answered only to the Nazgul stood straighter, more alert when the mouth entered their midst. He brought not fear alone, but order, an eerie, seamless coordination that needed no shouting. Wherever he walked, messages moved faster, discipline sharpened, and chaos seemed momentarily suspended. A simple nod from him was enough to send a unit retreating or a beast-driven siege rumbling forward. It was as if the battlefield bent slightly to accommodate his steps. Yet even this influence came at a cost. Within the command structures of Mordor, his presence began to blur the lines. who held true authority. The wraiths, unseen and unspoken, or this mortal mouthpiece who could speak where they could not. Jealousies sparked in hushed corners. Spies reported that some captains refused his counsel, not out of disobedience but from pride. And while Sauron's will silenced all dissent in the end, such fractures were not invisible. Still, the mouth continued his work, untiring, unblinking. From the ruins of Osgiliath to the slopes below Minas Morgul, he moved like a dark wind, shaping outcomes not through force, but by realigning expectations. The war was not just being fought on land and sky. It was being shaped within the minds of men. But even the strongest illusion must one day face interruption. At the edges of the Black Gate, where a decision would soon be demanded, there grew the sense that something was about to shift. The mouth had spoken his pronouncements for months without answer, and now, from the west, there came not silence but reply. The captains of the west would ride. They would not bend. And for the first time, the mouth's words would face resistance, not only in steel, but in speech. The gate was not a door in the ordinary sense. It did not swing on hinges or open with ceremony. It loomed black, immense, and silent, flanked by towers that rose like claws from the wounded earth. The Black Gate of Mordor had stood for centuries, not merely to bar entrance, but to proclaim that none who entered left unchanged. It was not meant to welcome. It was meant to end questions. And yet, on that morning, beneath a sky thinned by smoke and strained sunlight, it opened, not with haste, not with fear, but with deliberation. A pause fell across the assembled hosts of the West. Their banners shifted faintly in the breeze, but no one moved. What emerged was not a battalion, not a wraith, not some beast of darkness. It was a man, or what had once been one, clad in robes the color of scorched parchment, woven with thread that shimmered like old blood beneath dust. The Mouth of Sauron had come. He did not announce himself. He did not need to. The silence around him was shaped by his presence, as though the very air recognized the design it must follow. His horse, black and tall, bore the weight of ceremonial armor etched with runes that did not speak but condemned. Upon his head was a helm shaped like a broken tower, its iron lips stretched into an eternal sneer. But the eyes beneath the visor, what little could be seen, did not flicker. To those gathered, he appeared as something less than human, and more. His voice, when it came, did not rise in rage or triumph. It was flat, formal, carefully measured. It did not plead. It did not demand. It asserted, "You are brought before the Black Gate to accept the terms of surrender." And so the ritual began, not of diplomacy, but of dominance. Every movement the mouth made had been practiced within the black halls of Barad-dûr, rehearsed until even the flick of a finger could carry contempt. His presence was not that of an envoy, but of a verdict embodied. The robes he wore were stitched with sigils of binding. Each represented a conquered city, a crushed house, a sundered pact. Their shapes bent slightly as he moved, as if reluctant to obey even now. His voice, trained in the echoless chambers of the tower, reverberated despite the open plain. When he spoke, the captains of the West heard not only words, but the intention behind them, measured, absolute and cold as obsidian. There was no shouting, no need for force. That was the true genius of the performance. The mouth had been crafted for such moments, where the threat did not need to be named, because it had already been assumed. Confidence with which he delivered his false proofs, the cloak of Frodo, the tokens of fear, was not theatrical. It was clinical, designed to erode hope without requiring conflict. And for a moment it worked. There was a ripple among the ranks of the West, a hesitation that clung to breath. Could it be true? Had the ring-bearer failed? Were they now merely buying time for a doom already sealed? But the captains stood firm. Aragorn, wise with pain and quiet lineage. Gandalf, holding silence not as absence but as strategy. The mouth spoke, and they listened, but they did not yield. Something imperceptible shifted, not in the voice, but in the space behind it. The mouth remained unchanged, his speech delivered in full, yet the silence that followed did not conform. It held, not with deference, but with defiance. And in that moment, the ritual cracked. The performance had limits. It could suppress, subdue, persuade, but it could not command where belief still held. And belief had returned to the West. The mouth did not reveal anger. That was not permitted. Instead, his withdrawal was as controlled as his arrival. He turned not as a man defeated, but as a herald whose message had been heard and dismissed. Yet something lingered in the air after he vanished behind the closing gate. Not the echo of his words, but the shape of his presence, like an impression left in cooling wax. The captains knew now what sort of power they faced, not just in armies or sorcery, but in the very rituals of authority that sought to define the world's terms. But rituals once broken must be remade. The silence after the Black Gate closed was not the same as the silence before. It was heavier now, charged not with dread, but with defiance. And deep within the shifting fires of Barad-dûr, where the great eye roamed without lid or rest, the consequences of that silence were already unraveling. The mouth of Sauron returned not in triumph, but in stillness. He dismounted, passed through shadowed halls without speaking, and entered the inner chamber where words were not uttered but received. There, the rituals resumed. Not to cleanse failure, such a word had no place in Sauron's lexicon, but to reaffirm the mechanisms of control. The mouth, now alone, stood at the center of a ring of basalt columns, his hands outstretched, palms open. Words in the black speech rose from the floor in guttural waves, not from a speaker, but from the stone itself. They did not accuse. They reminded. Authority was not a mantle one wore lightly, and yet something in him had shifted. No visible twitch, no crack in tone, but the certainty that once buoyed each pronouncement no longer moved as freely through his spine. The captains of the West had not bent. They had not wept or raged. They had simply looked, listened, and refused. That refusal had not merely defied him, it had returned something to him, an echo. But discipline does not waver. The mouth's role was not to feel, but to carry. And so he moved through the machinery of Barad-dûr, reciting newer edicts, dispatching riders, commanding the siege engines arrayed on Mordor's inner plain. His voice retained its precision. It had to. Even a moment's softness would disrupt the order on which Sauron's system depended. It was here, in these acts of command, that the deeper machinery of Mordor revealed itself. The mouth did not give orders like a general. He enacted a design that flowed downward from the eye itself. His speech was not improvisation but execution, carved from the will of a master who did not tolerate deviation. Messages passed from him to the Nazgûl, from the Nazgûl to their lieutenants, from lieutenants to the captains of orcs, trolls, and men. Each phrase was measured, each instruction layered with contingencies. But such intricate machinery required a center of perfect stillness. The mouth was expected to be that stillness, and therein lay the cost. For each word he delivered as Sauron's voice, a small part of his own vanished further into silence. His dreams, when they came, bore no image, only the sound of words recited without source or end. He had no chambers of his own. His rest was taken in the Hall of Watchers, a vaulted space where time was marked not by sun or moon, but by the dim pulse of firelight through volcanic glass. There he stood, even in sleep, upright against the stone, as if awaiting the next sentence. Servants came and went. Food was set before him, but rarely touched. Robes were changed, scrolls replenished, and no one spoke. To speak in the presence of the mouth was to interrupt the circuit of command. And yet among those who served under him, murmurs persisted. Quiet tensions between commandants, moments where orders arrived late or altered. The mouth began to sense it, a faltering in the chain, a stiffness in what should have been fluid. The machinery of Mordor, once unquestioning, was beginning to catch on its own gears, not from rebellion, but from overuse. The war was nearing its crescendo, and the mouth's voice was stretched across too many fronts. He compensated with increased ritual. Each command was now prefaced with a gesture, a symbol drawn in the air, a breath held and released in sequence. He understood instinctively that control was not about shouting loudest, it was about maintaining rhythm. The moment the rhythm failed, all else would unravel. But rhythm required certainty, and the West had introduced doubt. Not among the masses, those would obey as long as the lash existed, but within the structure itself, where ambitions stirred behind helms and banners, there were captains who no longer knelt as low wraiths who listened longer before acting. Somewhere beneath the obedience a question was forming, and so the mouth returned to the chamber of basalt columns once more, standing beneath the eye's distant gaze, and spoke not aloud but inwardly. He did not ask for guidance. He asked only for clarity, to feel again that unbroken line between word and will, self and silence. The mouth stood at the edge of a balcony that overlooked Gorgoroth, where the land cracked like an old wound, and smoke danced endlessly along fault lines. The towers of Barad-dûr cast long shadows, even under a moonless sky. But it was not the vastness of the realm that held his attention. It was the silence beyond its borders, a silence that had begun to resist him. His commands still moved through the ranks. Orc legions still obeyed. Siege engines still rolled toward Gondor's ruined thresholds. Yet he could feel it, an imperceptible slowing, a slackness in the pulse, not in the muscles of war, but in the space between words and their reception. Fear, once immediate and liquid, had grown brittle. He had spent years shaping it, molding terror into a tool so refined it could fracture resolve with the gentlest pressure. But fear was not infinite. It had a memory, and worse, a limit. It had once been enough to send a whisper into the wind and see entire outposts crumble. Enough to utter a single name, his name, and feel the tremble of certainty ripple through the spines of men. But now, when his words reached the captains of the West, they did not fracture. They paused. They chose. And in choosing, they eroded the currency he once wielded without question. The mouth of Sauron had not failed, but he had been measured, and that measurement, silent, defiant, was a wound no armor could conceal. Within Barad-dûr, his chambers were unchanged. He walked its blackened corridors like a spectre, surrounded by stone that remembered only command. No creature met his gaze. None dared speak unless spoken to. Even the orcs gave him space, not out of respect but out of instinct, the same instinct that tells birds when storms are near. He studied maps with eyes that no longer blinked for weariness. He spoke decrees with a voice that betrayed nothing of uncertainty, but within him the measure of fear began to shift. He remembered a time barely, faintly, when language had nuance, when words were bridges, not blades. Now each sentence he crafted was a mechanism, a seal, a noose. There had been a moment, brief, crystalline, at the Black Gate, when the captains had refused, not with rage, not with mockery, but with clarity. That moment had followed him like a scent, not of failure, but of recognition. They had seen through him, not past him, but into him, and what they saw perhaps was a man who no longer lived in the words he spoke. Still the performance endured. In the eastern camps he arrived unannounced, and was received in ritual. Commanders knelt, lieutenants bowed, scouts presented reports, without meeting his gaze. But among the lower ranks, the cracks were visible. Orcs who muttered too loud, captains who hesitated before executing orders, rumors that he had been bested in speech. He dealt with these quietly. No need for spectacle. A glance, a phrase, a silence drawn too long. These things were enough to remind them, but each correction cost something. It was not merely authority he enforced, it was belief. And belief once cracked could not be resealed with fear alone. He knew this now. He had become an architect of dread, but dread depended on the unseen. Once unmasked, even a shadow had edges. So he adapted. New tactics emerged, not louder, not harsher, but colder. He began speaking less. A single sentence would carry the weight of 100. His presence alone became the warning. Where once he announced his arrival with banners and prelude, now he stepped into command tents unbidden, unannounced. His silence spoke first, and in that silence commanders restructured their reports, edited their intentions, corrected their own posture before he uttered a word. Yet fear enforced too often begins to lose shape. It becomes atmosphere, and atmosphere once grown familiar becomes weather, endurable, predictable. He could feel the curve of this inevitability. The more he enforced, the more they adapted. The more he pressed, the more they learned how to bend without breaking. Fear had once made them still. Now it merely made them quiet. He watched the western horizon that night, not for armies, but for tremors in the wind. The kind of tremor that came before a boundary was crossed, not of land, but of belief. The tower's inner halls no longer echoed with the confidence they once held. The air, though unmoved by wind, carried a quiet tautness, as though the stones themselves waited to hear what would come next. The mouth of Sauron moved through them without hesitation, but within his stride was a tension learned, not natural. He had spent long years mastering the rituals of command, rituals that now asked something more of him than mere repetition. In the early days, obedience had been clean. Orders were given. Orders were obeyed. The weight of the Dark Lord's will moved smoothly from the eye to the mouth, and from the mouth to the world. But now the motion stuttered within the camps of Mordor and the citadels it claimed. He began to encounter small resistances, curt nods where there had been bows, questions framed too closely to challenge. A captain requested clarification twice. A spy who delivered intelligence with eyes too steady. Such gestures, once unthinkable, now repeated, quiet but unmistakable. At first, he responded with precision. He returned the rituals to their sharpest form. Instructions delivered in the original black speech, tone controlled like a drawn wire. Punishments issued not in cruelty, but with the weight of inevitability. But the effect no longer resonated as it once had. Obedience remained, yet belief had begun to recede like water from a cracked vessel. He summoned the lieutenants in private. Not all at once, never all. In rooms without flame or mirror, beneath ceilings carved with the eye's angular mark, he spoke to them. Not as allies, but as instruments. He reminded them what it meant to carry the mandate of Mordor. He reminded them that silence was not merely absence of sound, but presence of control. Some lowered their gaze. Others met his with the empty bravado of those who do not yet know fear. A commander of the eastern forges asked quietly, and if silence breaks, the mouth did not answer. Not with words. He stepped closer. Closer still until the air thickened. The forger-master's lips parted, perhaps to explain, perhaps to protest. But no sound emerged. His throat locked mid-breath. No spell had been cast, no curse spoken, only presence, and in that presence the fear returned briefly, sharply, like a blade brushing skin without cutting. The commander nodded. Too quickly. He would not speak again without permission, but the damage had already rippled. For each resistance crushed, another question flickered elsewhere. In private, the mouth began to consider what could not be said aloud. That authority, once embodied, could not live forever in borrowed fear. That obedience, when stretched too far, curdled into spectacle. He stood in his observation chamber and watched the endless churn of Gorgoroth, its ash towers rising like memories of ruined vows. The forges burned. The patrols moved. But the clarity he once inhabited felt distant now, like a language misremembered. He wondered, once, what it had cost to lose his name. Not the word itself, but the sequence of memory it tethered. He remembered only that he had spoken once for himself, before his voice was narrowed to a blade, before each word he uttered served a will not his own. He did not regret it. Regret was a luxury for those who lived by choice. He had not lived by choice in a long time. Still, the thought lingered. If the voice wavers, what remains? He walked the perimeter of Barad-dûr that night, unaccompanied, his shadow passing through corridors carved by heat and oath. No one stopped him. None dared ask. But some watched. A servant glimpsed him pause before a ruined fresco, one long burned but faintly visible in the stone. Shapes of men kneeling before a figure crowned in shadow. Their faces had been smoothed away by time, but the posture was clear, submission etched into form. The mouth reached out and touched the edge of the stone, not with reverence, with recognition. He had become what the fresco depicted. He had embodied it so completely that even the image no longer startled him. Yet the knowledge stung, not because it revealed something new, but because it had always been there, just beyond his reach. In the stillness, he recalled again the silence at the Black Gate. Not the refusal, the quiet, the gaze of the West, unmarred by fear, yet not cruel. The choice to see him not as a terror, but as a man. That memory did not wound him. It marked him. In the heart of Barad-dûr, beyond the war chambers and the vaults of commands, etched in stone, lay a chamber not known to orcs or men. It bore no name. Those who guarded its entrance spoke only when summoned, and even then their words were few. The Mouth of Sauron entered without announcement. None barred his way. It was expected that he would return here when the eye required recalibration of will. The chamber was circular, its walls carved with glyphs too ancient to trace. The ceiling lost to shadow above a single obsidian table at its center. This was the Council of Shadows, a space not of open debate, but of ritual alignment. Here, emissaries gathered not as individuals, but as functions of a greater order. Those who had names had long ceased to use them. The Black Númenórean priest, the Morennan strategist, the keeper of keys from the Tower of Cirith Ungol, and now the Mouth. They did not speak in the common tongue. Their language was stripped of decoration, reduced to necessity. Every phrase bore weight and intention. Every pause a silence sanctioned by the eye. No sentiment passed between them. They were not equals. They were parallel instruments. The Mouth took his place, robes trailing like ash over the stone. His presence was not contested, but neither was it greeted. This was not a council of affirmation. It was a convergence of mandates. A map was projected by flame onto the floor, fluid, flickering, marked with embers for armies and pulses for strongholds. The siege lines tightened around Minas Tirith. The mountains seethed with movement. but a hollow had formed in the west, something not accounted for. "The captain's delay," intoned the keeper. "The gate was not taken." A pause, no blame. But the statement lingered like cooled metal. The strategist spoke next. "The east remains disciplined. The Haradrim hold the line. But the northern passage," he hesitated, "not from fear, from doubt, rare and unwelcome. There is a rhythm to their defiance," said the priest. "It does not fray under pressure." The mouth listened. He did not interrupt. His role here was not dominance. It was reinforcement, binding the strands of strategy to the singular will that pulsed above them all. But something within him, small, almost imperceptible, wavered, not from disagreement, but from awareness. The rhythm was real, and he had heard it first at the Black Gate. He spoke, finally, his voice low and calibrated. "They do not hold hope. They hold clarity." The others turned, not in shock, but in recognition. Clarity was more dangerous than hope. Hope could be poisoned. Clarity endured even in darkness. The priest replied, "Then fracture the clarity." The mouth nodded. "It must be reshaped from within. Not by threat, but by proof." Proof. The word hung in the air, too loud in its quiet. It was a rare tool in Mordor's arsenal, not because they lacked it, but because they seldom needed it. Proof was offered only when fear began to dull. The council dissolved without ceremony. No salutes, no farewells, only motion. The mouth withdrew into the corridor, shadow closing behind him. Yet something of that gathering stayed with him. For the first time he had introduced not a command but a diagnosis. He had named the condition of the enemy, and in naming it he had acknowledged that something vital lay beyond his reach. He returned to his private vaults, not his quarters, for he did not possess any space that bore the intimacy of sleep. This vault was lined with relics, fragments of enemy banners, broken hilts, tokens recovered from fallen spies. But at its center stood a mirror, not of glass, but of burnished steel, polished smooth as water, and cold to the touch. He had never once looked into it for reflection. It was a tool, not a vanity. Tonight, he did not look away. What stared back was neither triumph nor ruin, but a face carved into function. No scars, no features out of place. But something in the eyes had dulled, not from weakness, from overuse. He had spoken so long as another's will that the silence afterward now lingered like an aftertaste. Clarity. The captains of the West had spoken without fear, because they had nothing left to protect except each other. They did not war for dominance. They warred for the right to choose, even at the edge of death. And he, what had he chosen? He stepped back from the mirror and extinguished the vault's lone flame. Tomorrow he would speak again, and armies would move. But tonight, the stillness in his throat asked no questions. Yet still, it waited. The banners of the West fluttered before the gates of Mordor, weathered but upright, their cloth faded by smoke and sun. Behind them stood the remnants of resistance, not in numbers vast enough to rival the Dark Lord's hosts, but in a silence that would not bend. The captains had made their choice. They had come not to win but to draw attention away from the true fire moving far beneath the mountain. And the Mouth of Sauron stood once more atop the battlements of the Black Gate, watching them. He did not yet descend. There would be no negotiation this time, no false offering, no display of tokens meant to dissolve hope. He had tried the art of the spoken blade. They had not flinched. Now he turned inward, not in doubt, but in calibration. What must be spoken when words no longer sting? What shape must the voice take when the ear no longer recoils? He descended slowly, through the tower's inner chambers past the war tables and watchers, and emerged before the gate, The host behind him stood silent, row upon row of armor and darkness, ready to consume. But he did not speak to them. He moved alone, mounted once more, armored in black and silver that reflected only the ash in the sky. The captains of the West waited at the parley ground, where once they had refused his declarations. This time there was no conversation, no bargaining. Their gaze met his with stillness, not defiance, as if to say, "We have heard your voice already. We know its shape." And still the mouth spoke, but not to convince, not even to frighten. He recited the inevitability of their doom, the futility of their march, the hopelessness of those who still clung to the flickering idea of freedom. His words were perfect in structure, sharp in cadence, drawn from the same well of darkness that had sustained him for decades. And yet, nothing in their eyes shifted. They listened as one might listen to a ritual once sacred, now drained of meaning, not with contempt, but with distance. The mouth of Sauron had not changed, but the world around him had. For the first time in memory, he felt his voice move out from him and not return. No echo, no yield, only stillness. Then the gates opened fully, not for speech but for war. The armies of Mordor poured forth like floodwaters, black and endless, and the mouth turned from the parley ground, no longer the harbinger, but the observer. His role had been performed. The pageant of fear had reached its final act. He did not retreat to the tower. Instead, he rode to a small outcropping that overlooked the battlefield, where no banners flew. There he watched. The clash was thunder without rain, iron against shield, hoof against stone, and in the noise, in the ruin, the mouth searched for the sound of belief breaking. He listened for cries that signaled despair. He listened for the silence that meant surrender. But he heard only resolve. Even as the West bent beneath the weight of Mordor's fury, it did not collapse. Its line curved but did not fracture. Their voices rose not in pleas, but in calls to one another. This was not how it had been meant to end. Fear was supposed to consume before the blade struck. The mouth of Sauron had been shaped to prevent resistance before it began. But here, at the very gates of annihilation, his words had no power. He remained until the battle thickened and the black banners surged forward. His horse stamped the stone. His hands, so steady for so long, curled faintly at the reins. For beneath all the noise, there was another silence forming, a different kind. It came from the east, a tremor in the eye. He felt it before any horn sounded, a fracture, not in the enemy ranks, but in the tower behind him. A shudder passed through the ground, not from siege, but from within. He turned, and in that moment, far off yet impossibly close, a cry rose not from the field, but from the heart of Mount Doom. A pulse, a breaking. Something had been cast away, not a weapon, but a truth. The eye faltered. The mouth gasped, though no air escaped. He turned again to the battlefield, and saw confusion spreading like ink. Mordor's ranks trembled. The wraiths wailed. The sky itself darkened, not with storm, but with unraveling. And still he did not speak. There were no words left that could shape what now began to fall. The ground did not shake. It recoiled. From the heart of Mordor to the blackened plains of Gorgoroth, the very bones of the land spanned as if casting off a dream long endured. In the sky above, the eye shuddered. It flared once with blind fury, then began to unmake itself, threads of fire unraveling into wind. There was no explosion, no scream, just a long, collapsing absence, like the final exhale of something that had never truly breathed. From his perch at the edge of the field, the mouth of Sauron watched without motion. His horse had reared once, then stilled, made dumb with fear or revelation. Around him the legions buckled, trolls dropped to their knees, roaring in confusion. Orcs clutched their heads or scattered in wild animal panic. Even the Nazgul, who had not bowed to earth in centuries, twisted in the air like tattered cloth, their forms flickering, their anchors under. The mouth did not flee. He remained as the black gate groaned open behind him, not from design but from the loss of pressure. The air itself had loosened its grip. The power that had once held the world clenched had gone slack. He turned slowly, facing eastward, to the place he had never dared ascend, Mount Doom. It glowed not with fury now, but with aftermath. The light from within had dimmed. What had burned with malice now smoldered like the remnants of a ritual incomplete. He understood, though no voice told him. The ring had been cast, the tether broken. The will behind his voice was gone. It did not come to him as grief. Not yet. What arrived first was disorientation, vast and cold, for the first time in memory. There was no directive in his spine, no instruction humming beneath his ribs, no compulsion in his breath. The silence that filled him now was not the useful stillness of obedience. It was the silence of separation. He opened his mouth, not to issue command, not to denounce, simply to speak. A single sound. Nothing came. The voice that had bound armies, bent wills, rewritten fates, it faltered, not from injury, but from absence. He touched his throat, gently, with fingers that had not trembled in years. The muscles still moved, but the voice, the true voice, was gone. What remained was his, and he did not yet know its shape. He dismounted slowly. Around him chaos bloomed. Mordor's army no longer fought, it unraveled. Captains tried to rally soldiers who had already turned their backs. Creatures bred only for war now cowered in the dirt. Some clawed at their own ears, unable to endure the dissonance of a world no longer ordered. He walked through them. None stopped him. Many did not see him at all. The mouth, once a figure so feared that his shadow was enough to silence dissent, now passed like a ghost among the crumbling edifice of power. He reached the gate itself. Its iron teeth, blackened by time and fire, stood parted in defeat. Beyond them, the captains of the West advanced, not in triumph, but in caution. They moved as those who had expected death and found something stranger. Victory. They did not trust. The mouth did not meet them. He stepped aside, not out of submission, but from an understanding too deep to explain. His war had ended not in fire, but in silence, not in defeat, but in the loss of purpose. He turned once more to look back at the tower. Barad-dûr was cracking. Long vertical seams, splitting through its obsidian flanks, glowing faintly with internal ruin. Its crown, once crowned by the eye, now poured smoke in spirals. The tower swayed, groaned, and in that moment he saw it clearly, not as a throne but as a cage. He had lived within its geometry, spoken its will, worn its voice like a garment stitched into skin. And now, stripped of it, he felt not only smaller, but lighter. He did not rejoice. There was no joy in the unraveling, but there was space. A question formed within him, not spoken but felt, like warmth returning to numb flesh. What now? He could not answer. Not yet. But the asking itself was something. The Mouth of Sauron, who had once believed himself emptied for the sake of a greater will, now stood at the edge of a world that no longer needed his silence. The rituals were broken. The script had ended, and in its place, not ruin, not yet, but the faint and terrible beginning of a self he had long forgotten. The corridors beneath Barad-dûr were no longer lit. Whatever glow had once pulsed through the veins of the tower, fed by fire, by will, by command, had drained into stillness. The mouth walked alone through the stone halls, each step echoing softer now, as if the darkness itself had grown less attentive. There were no guards at the threshold, no sentinels at the inner gates, only the heavy hush of a place abandoned not by feet but by meaning. He had not expected to return. When the eye fell and the armies scattered, his role should have ended, not in death but in dispersion, like smoke released from a sealed chamber. And yet he had come back, not to command, but to understand. Something inside him, long silenced, now stirred with questions too old to name. He passed through the Chamber of Oaths, where once he had memorized the decrees of Mordor, word by word, sealed in blood and silence. The scrolls had crumbled, the ink had faded, but the table remained, carved from blackened cedar, its surface scarred by decades of decisions. He laid one hand upon it, fingertips brushing against grooves worn by his own arms, long ago. He could remember, dimly, the day he had first been brought here, hooded, kneeling, speaking not his name but a vow not to serve, but to become, the moment he surrendered speech as identity, and allowed it to become utility. Now, walking among the ruins, that vow no longer gripped him. But neither did it release him. He was no longer bound, and yet he could not yet be free. He descended further, to the place few had entered, the vault of unmarked masks. Here once Sauron had kept the ceremonial visages of those who spoke on his behalf, not out of vanity, but of strategy. A mask was never for disguise. It was for continuity. Faces changed, voices cracked, but the illusion of permanence had to endure. He found his own. It sat atop a pedestal of black stone, shaped like a mouth stretched into knowing silence, not snarling, not smiling, just waiting. He had worn it once, though not always. In war it was armor, in council symbol, but now, unlit and untouched, it looked small. He lifted it with both hands. It was lighter than he remembered. The weight had never been in the metal. It had been in the purpose, and that purpose had left with the eye. The urge to put it on returned, not as a command, but as a habit. To wear it was to feel whole, if only in repetition. But something within him resisted. A voice not heard in decades. Not Sauron's, not the black speech, his own. He set the mask down, not in ceremony, not in disdain, simply deliberate. There was no transformation waiting here, no great revelation in the ruins, only the slow reassembly of a self long partitioned. The man who had once studied languages, the one who had believed that words could bridge realms instead of control them, a boy who had whispered questions into library halls before he learned that questions in Mordor could become crimes. That boy was not returning. The world had burned too long for that. But in the silence of the vault, some remnant of him stirred, not naive, not innocent, but curious. He rose and turned from the mask, not in rejection, in acknowledgement. It had served its function, and now, so had he. On the stairwell back into the lightless chamber, he paused. The tower above groaned, fractured by its own vanishing purpose. Stones shifted, foundations unknotted. Barad-dûr would not stand much longer, and still he walked upward, not hurried, not afraid. If the tower collapsed, so be it. He would not run. He had walked into this darkness by choice long ago. Now he would walk out, if not by path, then by presence. The Mouth of Sauron no longer had a master, no voice to carry but his own. He did not yet know what that voice might say. It had no command, no decree, no audience, but it waited somewhere beneath the ash to speak. He stepped out into the windless dark. The land was still. The fire had died, and above him, for the first time in memory, the sky was just beginning to clear. Smoke lingered in thin spirals along the broken spires of Barad-dûr, not rising but drifting low as if reluctant to leave. The tower had not fully fallen. It leaned now, cracked open along its central axis, its symmetry undone. Stones still held their place by habit, not by strength, and far below, beyond the crumbling gates and the scattered remnants of war, the Mouth of Sauron walked without direction. There was no escort, no command to fulfill, no face turned toward him with fear or reverence. The land itself seemed to have turned inward, hushed by the weight of what had been lost. Orc camps lay abandoned or smoldering. War machines sat rusting in place. The few creatures that still roamed did so in confusion, their purpose broken like the chain that once bound them. He moved through it like a figure half remembered, not a ghost, but something rarer, someone living beyond the role that defined him. No one stopped him. He passed through ruins that once bore banners with the eye, their sigils blackened, torn, and meaningless now. And yet he was not hunted. Perhaps they thought him already dead. Perhaps they no longer saw him at all. In the days that followed, he kept to the margins of the ruined plain, where ash collected in shallow basins, and the wind moaned like a voice trying to remember a song. He did not sleep in the way others did. Dreams came too suddenly, too raw, and then vanished before he could catch their meaning. But he rested beneath collapsed overhangs or within cracked stone halls, watching the sky with a gaze that no longer searched for signs. The world was not what it had been. Not for him. Not for anyone. At night he whispered phrases, not in the black speech, but in older tongues, languages he had not spoken since before he had become the Mouth. Fragments of poetry, names of places, lost, words he did not know if he still believed in. And as he whispered, something within began to align, not into certainty, but into presence. He began to listen differently, not to armies or orders, but to the silence between things, the hush between broken stones, the spaces where words once ruled. From time to time, he encountered others, refugees, soldiers, beings lost to war. Some watched him with weariness, others passed without pause. He did not speak. They did not ask. But once, on the seventh dusk after the fall, he came upon a man, a rider of Gondor, wounded alone. The man raised a blade in trembling hands, but lowered it when the Mouth made no move. "Are you one of them?" the man asked. The Mouth looked at him for a long moment, then answered, not with command, not with rhetoric, but softly. "I was." The rider blinked. And now? He did not answer, not directly. But his silence was no longer the silence of power. It was the silence of change. The man nodded slowly, as if some small understanding had passed between them. He bound his wound and rode on. The Mouth did not follow. By the 10th day, the smoke in the sky began to lift. Not completely, just enough to reveal the outline of stars. It had been years, decades, since he had truly seen them. During his service, the sky had always been a ceiling, not a guide, a thing to keep the world pressed low. But now, beneath it, he felt something new. Not freedom, not yet, but weightlessness. The burden that had filled his throat, his spine, his thoughts, had receded. It had not vanished, but it no longer dictated his motion. He stood that night on the slope of a hill made from broken siege works, watching the constellations. He remembered, dimly, the names of some, not the names Sauron had taught. Those were stripped of wonder, but older names spoken in his youth when the sky had still been a question. He whispered one aloud. The sound of it startled him. It had come not from memory, but from self. It was his voice, unshaped by ritual, uncoiled from command. He closed his eyes. For the first time, the silence within him did not ache. It did not demand to be filled. It simply was, and in it a thought. He had once believed that speech defined power, that to speak with force was to control. But now he saw the inverse, that the most powerful thing he had ever done was to speak without purpose, not to bend, not to bind, but to remember. He moved westward, slowly, deliberately through lands that once trembled at the shadow of Mordor, now silent under a sky turning pale with dawn. The fields near the Moranen, once churned by siegecraft and soaked in blood, had begun to settle. Grass did not yet grow, but wind moved freely again. Birds, tentative and rare, circled high above. The silence he had carried for so long now met a silence that belonged to the world, not to war. The mouth walked without destination. There were no borders left to guard, no boundaries to enforce. He passed villages scarred by fire, towns abandoned in the wake of dread. Here and there, signs of return. Children's laughter, faint music, cooking smoke curling from rebuilt homes. None recognized him. Or perhaps they did, and chose not to speak it. He had removed the robes weeks ago. The armor had gone before that, stripped piece by piece, and left beside rivers, beneath trees, buried under cairns of stone. Each part he shed was not defiance. It was a return, not to what he had been, but to what he might become, now unencumbered. He crossed into Ithilien beneath golden leaves, and the scent of earth not yet scorched. The forests whispered around him, not in menace, but in memory. Here the war had burned fiercely. Here, too, the earth had endured. He reached a small outpost, a watchtower, half-built, rising from stone with cautious hope. Young men and women, soldiers not long removed from battle, moved among the scaffolding, fitting beams together. One of them looked up as he approached. He said nothing. They studied him, weariness in their posture, then simply nodded, as if recognizing a man returned from something vast and wordless. No questions were asked. A bowl of stew was offered, a place to sit, and he accepted. Later he helped them lift timbers into place. His hands, unused to honest labor, trembled at first, but the rhythm came back, motion, effort, breath, the quiet blessing of sweat earned not through command, but through use. At night, by the fire, he listened to stories, to laughter, to grief, spoken plainly, without ornament. He did not offer his own tale, not because he feared their judgment, but because it was still being written. One evening, a young woman, brown-eyed, hair tied back in a soldier's knot, asked gently, "What were you before the war?" He looked into the flames. "A student," he said. She smiled. "So was I. Music." He did not respond, but his eyes softened. They sat together in silence, not the weaponized silence he had once wielded, a shared silence, a bridge. Days passed, then weeks. In time, they came to trust him, not with secrets, but with simple things, carrying stones, digging trenches, watching for returning caravans. He slept beneath a roof again, crude and unfinished, but it held. Sometimes he still woke before the sun, the old rhythm pulling him from dreams. He would stand alone beneath the fading stars, his hands clasped as if waiting for a command that no longer came. Then, slowly, he would lower them, exhale, and begin again. He found he could speak now, softly, without pressure. He taught the youngest how to shape words clearly, how to project without strain, how to listen between lines. They teased him, calling him old voice. He did not mind. It was not mockery. It was belonging. One afternoon, As the rains came in from the east, he stood at the edge of the rebuilt wall, watching the storm roll across the plain. He thought of Barad-dûr, not with longing, not with regret, but with a kind of distant compassion. The tower had held him once, shaped him, but it had not destroyed him. What he had carried, fear, precision, silence, was not wasted, but it had run its course. Now, his silence meant something else. Not obedience, not dread, but space, a place for others to speak, to rebuild, to remember. He touched his throat one last time, as if to feel the echo of a voice that had belonged to another. Then he turned back toward the tower, and the woodwork, the laughter and the scaffolding. He picked up a hammer, and began again. In the months that followed, the scars across the land began to fade. Not quickly, not completely, but the rhythm of life, long interrupted by war, returned in small, persistent gestures. Trees that had been burned down to roots began to sprout again. Villages rebuilt stone by stone. Fields once trampled beneath iron now moved with green. And in the quiet hours between labor and rest, people spoke not of the Dark Lord, not of ruin, but of what might come next. The Mouth of Sauron, though no longer known by that name, lived among them, neither exalted nor condemned. The villagers called him different things: Old Voice, Silent Man, Black Cloak, though his garments were now plain and earth-colored. They did not ask his story, and he did not offer it. It lived in his silence, and that was enough. He worked with wood now, not as a master, but as one who listens to grain and shape. He helped build doors that did not guard, but welcomed, tables wide enough for 10, cribs, tools, things meant for continuity, not command. And though his hands bore memory of ritual, once clenched in decree, once raised in threat, they softened with each new gesture. Each nail set was a phrase rewritten. At the edge of the settlement stood a low stone hall. Not a temple, though some treated it as sacred. A place for gatherings, for stories, for music returned to mouths once too frightened to sing. Children played beneath its beams. Elders wove tapestries along the inner walls, images of fields and rivers, not thrones. He spent time there often, not at the center, but along the walls, listening. Language returned to him in unfamiliar forms: laughter, lullabies, questions asked with no agenda. For a man who had once believed every word must carry consequence, this was a new kind of magic, a magic unburdened by dominion. One evening, a girl approached him with a slate in her hand, charcoal smudged on her fingers. She held it up shyly. "Can you teach me to write like you?" He took the slate, turned it in his palms. The letters were uneven, some reversed, but they were there. He smiled, a quiet smile, the kind that does not reach the lips but softens the eyes. "Yes," he said. The lessons began in the morning hours, when the village was quiet and the sun had not yet broken the frost from the grass. More children came, then a few adults. Not all stayed. But those who did learned slowly, syllable by syllable, how to speak with ink instead of voice. He taught them with care, not with the force of old drills or the cadence of chants, but with questions. What do you want the word to do? How does the shape feel in your hand? Do you hear it before you write it or after? It was not the teaching that changed him. It was the listening, the way they spoke their own meanings into the page, unafraid of being wrong, the way they shared phrases without suspicion. And it struck him, gently, like rain on slate, that this was what had always been missing. Not control, not silence, but exchange. He had been a mouth, yes, but never an ear. Until now, as winter turned to spring, a delegation passed through the village riders from Gondor, cloaked in blue and white, bearing news of treaties, land restoration, roads to be rebuilt. They saw him. One of them knew him, but none spoke it aloud. After they departed, one of the elders asked, "Will they come back for you?" He shook his head. "There's nothing left to take." The elder nodded. "Good." Another silence followed, not tense, not reverent, just shared. And so he remained, not as a relic, not as a caution, but as a presence among others. He did not reclaim a name. He did not need to. Names were useful for direction, but he no longer wandered. He was where he chose to be. Sometimes, in the dark before dawn, he still woke with the feeling of the tower pressing down, the taste of command lingering like smoke on his tongue. But he did not fear it. He simply rose, washed his hands, and waited for the children to arrive with their slates. This, he knew now, was his quiet inheritance, not redemption, not erasure, but continuation. The Dark Lord had fallen. The tower had crumbled. The voice that once commanded shadows had grown still, and from that stillness, a new language had begun to form. There came a day, late in the thawing of spring, when he stood alone in the field beyond the village, and felt the weight of time settle differently in his chest. The wind had shifted, no longer sharp with winter's edge, but soft, filled with pollen and the distant hum of water, moving under stone. The world, once mute beneath the heel of command, now murmured again in its own tongue, and the mouth, who no longer called himself that, listened. He carried a small satchel over his shoulder. Nothing of significance, just tools, parchment, twine, not for ritual, for tending. There was a fence to be mended along the orchard. Some of the posts had bowed under snow and needed righting. It was the kind of task that asked for no audience, the kind he had come to prefer. As he walked, the children from the village passed him on the trail, one calling out his new name, not a true name, not one from any history, just a simple syllable they had given him when they tired of calling him sir. He smiled and lifted a hand. The girl laughed and ran ahead, her slate under her arm, feet dusted in spring soil. He watched her go, and felt the strange peace of continuity settle behind his ribs. Not triumph, not salvation, just present. He reached the grove where the young trees had taken root, planted months ago after the last of the frost, when the ground could finally be turned without breaking steel. Each sapling bore a ribbon marked with a different child's drawing. Some had faces, some stars, some only swirling lines, symbols without lineage. They swayed now, ribbons whispering like forgotten dreams that had chosen not to vanish. He knelt at the leaning post, unslinging his satchel. The work was slow, the kind that required attention, but not thought. He liked that. In another life, he had given commands that reshaped cities. Now he shaped earth, rope, and quiet, one knot at a time. As he worked, a shadow passed over the hilltop. A rider, not armored, clothed in the gray of wandering lawkeepers, those who carried stories to the far edges of the world, not as warnings but as offerings. The rider paused when they saw him, then dismounted and approached. "You are the one," the rider said, softly, from the gate. He straightened but did not rise. The soil stained his palms, his tunic was worn, patched at the elbows. He looked nothing like the figure who had once stood before kings and dared to name surrender, and yet the echo remained. "I was," he answered. The rider regarded him with curiosity, but no fear. "There are those who say you vanished into ash. Others claim you took your own voice and buried it at the roots of the tower." He tilted his head slightly, amused by the myth. Voices are not buried. They are outgrown. A silence passed between them, wind sifting the leaves. "Do you regret it?" the rider asked, not unkindly. He did not answer at first. He finished tying the post, brushed his hands clean against his knees, and stood. He looked out across the field, where the orchard curved into the hills, where children's laughter rose faintly through the trees. "I regret," he said, "the years I spoke without listening." The rider nodded and said nothing more. They mounted again, offered a quiet farewell, and disappeared down the western road. He remained at the orchard's edge, watching the light shift across the valley. He did not wonder where the rider would take that story. It no longer mattered. The truth of who he had been would scatter like seed in the wind. Some would grow in the soil of caution, others in forgiveness. Most would not grow at all. But here, in this place, the story was not about endings. It was about tending. The sun dipped low, and he walked back toward the village, boots soft against the path. At the gates, the girl with the slate met him again, tugging at his hand. "Will you tell us a story tonight?" she asked. He paused. Not long ago, that request would have made him withdraw. The idea of speaking again to shape minds, to influence, had felt too close to what he had once done. But tonight, the question felt different. It asked not for power, but for presence. "I will," he said. And later, seated beside the hearth, with faces gathered near and firelight flickering on walls built by many hands, he spoke, not of battles, not of towers, but of rivers that remembered the names of stones, of winds that had learned to sing, of a voice that once belonged to no one, and then one day returned